I asked Daniel Huff and Tonu Kalam to share with me some of their ideas about communicating to ensembles. Let's see some excerpts of those conversations. I think conductors often struggle with the issue of how many instructions to give at the same time. I know for myself, sometimes I'll just give one and go, and sometimes I'll give, well, I want to avoid a laundry list, but I might give more than one. How do you approach that issue?
Well, I'd want to be in your band. I'd want to have one and go. I think it's an interesting byproduct of the fact that when you conduct, you think of yourself producing art. But I think most good conductors initially, or at least ones who deal with ensembles where there's a strong element of actually doing everything. You have to teach the people in order to produce the sound, in order to create the whatever that you're going to do. You're a long ways from art when you start. And the more instructions you give, the more you sort of clutter the background information. And it's difficult, in my experience, for students to necessarily know, or for young singers or singers of amateur singers, we'll call them that, to know exactly what to focus on first. So I'm a strong believer in what you just said. Say one thing, do one thing. Secondly, I think the extent to which you go deep on whatever it is that you do is more valuable than that you cover a wide variety of ground. You know, we've all seen people who start out and say at letter A, I'd like you to sing this more of a piano, and 4 bars in, I want you to be crescendo to a mezzo forte, and then I want you to taper gradually over the next 16 bars to a piano, and oh, by the way, the diphthong was wrong in measure 32, and on and on and on and on and on. And the last thing that you say is probably the one thing that they attempt to do, missing totally the entire point. Whereas if you'd have just simply started out and said, let's start at letter A, and I want you to follow my hand and go, then one of two things is going to happen. They'll either know what it is you want them to attend to and learn to follow a conductor's gesture, in which case the next time you don't have to tell them that again. You can just say, why didn't you follow my hand? Come on, let's get here. In other words, I think the real question that you're asking is, do you assume that because you can verbalize something which they're going to experience physically and musically and intellectually as a synthesized process, as an event, are they able to translate what you say in words into something that they then attempt to replicate or to do or to accomplish musically? And I think the jury would be very much out on that question. I'd be astounded if amateur singers are able to compute the number of variables that that would be included in some kind of a long list.
I guess in the instrumental world, we may give a few more instructions. I wonder if you'd agree with this, whereas the flutes might be doing, or often would be doing, something completely differently from what the tubas are doing. Mm-hmm. So I can give 2 instructions, because if I only give one, then I'm leaving out lots of different instruments. So I think play that. So are there issues with that with, say, soprano bass?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so you might give more than one.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. But that, I don't consider that giving multiple, because they're going to hear flutes 1, and somebody else something else.
Right.
And each one is going to have one. Yeah. But the interesting thing is when you use that kind of rehearsal technique, now whoever it is you've paired with the flutes are sensitive to the fact that whatever it is that they're doing has got a relationship to whatever it is that the flutes are doing, and there's a specific structural and expressive difference involved in that. So now they're attuned to that. And, for instance, if there's something dramatically different in terms of the articulation, it's really hard for you to conduct legato in one hand and something else in another hand. And you have to teach them at some point to actually read what they see, interpret what they see as a way of actually expressing things, and then you beat time. I mean, when in doubt, a good friend of mine told me early on, when in doubt, the basic pattern would be nice. I mean, our common joke, if you threw a watermelon and a conductor off a 3rd-story floor, who'd hit the ground first? Or the watermelon, of course, the conductor would get lost on the way down. I mean, my point is that when in doubt, clarity is the prime imperative. And so, that example is a classic example of multiple instructions, but it's going to be heard as only one. Right. I think when you begin teaching a group, especially if they're raw beginners, it's really hard to have faith in the fact that they have to learn the process as well as the notes. And if you give them every error, then A, they become dependent on you for error detection in perpetuity and don't end up becoming independent musicians. And B, there's a risk that you'll just muddy the waters to the extent that they don't know what it is you really want them to concentrate on when and how that's accomplished. And, using your flute example, if you want them to do a particular kind of articulation, and knowing you as I do, I'd be willing to bet you'd sing them the articulation.
Very often.
Rather than say, I want this articulated, you'd sing it and cut to the chase. And you'd do something else with whoever it is that's against that. And you do the exact same thing in a choir. If you want somebody to pay attention to this thing and somebody else to pay attention to this thing because they're related in this way, then you articulate that relationship and say, so you're going to do, and you're going to do that, and that's how we're going to function. Let's try it.
And some of those relationships we point out, some we allow them to make themselves.
Well, after they get the idea, they begin looking for the relationships, and those are the days you go home, ready to continue with your life because somebody has come up to you and said, I noticed, and you say, bless you, my child, where have you been all my life?
And don't worry, tonight's assignment is not going to be throw a watermelon and a conductor off a roof and see which hits the ground first.
I think certainly we would agree that we'd rather be conducting than talking in rehearsal, but certainly there are many times when we have to address the group. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your approach to addressing the group, talking about musical ideas, musical terms, and how you approach that.
Yes, I have various ways I've developed over the years of communicating my ideas to the group, in addition to the manual of the beat patterns in the left hand. I find, especially with less experienced players, it's very important to give them some kind of sense of character, of style, what is the piece about, what kind of sound are we trying to achieve? What is the mood? Very simple things like that. So I can use sometimes very simple adjectives to just say, all right, this should sound a little bit more heroic, or this is just over the top bombastic, give it more. Here we need something extremely delicate and distant and dolce. Little things like that will go a long way to getting the right sound that we want. I tend to sing quite often in rehearsals to demonstrate how a phrase should go. I think it's much easier just sing a line rather than say, well, I want it to get louder here by the third note, and then you come down to sort of a mezzo piano, and then make this one shorter, and they've fallen asleep by then. So you really need to just sing it, they'll imitate it. Extremely valuable. Everybody knows that conductors don't pretend to be singers. We all have terrible voices and we sound horrible when we sing, but that's the way we get the best results. The best conductors are always modeling by singing for their ensembles what they want to hear. Whether it's an attack, and you can say, I want an attack that sounds like da, or like pa, or however, as soon as they hear it, they can imitate it on their instrument. So that's a very important thing. I think it's important to consider the mix of playing and talking when you're rehearsing. And this goes back to the idea of how do we run a rehearsal, how do we pace a rehearsal. The momentum of a rehearsal is extremely important. Players get a little bit antsy if you talk too much because they're there to play. They're not there for a lecture. And yet there are certain things you have to talk about in order to get the best results. And so you find a mix of playing through a large chunk, going back, fixing a few things, playing them again, moving on. Sometimes you have to take things apart more often, but once you've established a basic concept about how a phrase goes or what kind of articulation and when this motive comes back every time, once you've established that, they'll do it every time. You don't have to stop every few bars for the same idea to set it up. It can be very tedious if you stop and start, and stop and start. It makes the rehearsal feel longer, it tires people out, and you lose their motivation and focus, especially if you've got a 2 or 3 hour rehearsal to get through. So that's something that you build up over the years, the experience of how to pace your time and being very observant of your players, watching their mood and seeing, are they getting restless? Are they turning around and looking at the clock on the wall? Or are they engaged in what they're doing? If they're not engaged, you have to find a way to get them engaged. Sometimes I come to the end of a rehearsal and I see people are getting restless. I think the only way to solve this is to just start and play through a large chunk of music, no stopping, so they don't have time to get tired. So that's part of the important thing too. But again, I think singing, creating some kind of atmosphere of character and style and understanding a context for the piece, making them aware of their role in the piece is part of my process, a very important process, and this is something that, of course, relates to balance and texture at sorting out things, depending on the composer. Some composers are extremely skillful, of course, at writing orchestration that is so transparent you don't have to work at it. Other composers, there's a lot going on texturally and compositionally, and you have to work hard to sort things out. Whether you ask some people to play softer, some to play louder, but making them aware. Here's the melody, now you pass it over to this player. Now it goes here. If you can't hear it moving around through the ensemble, then you're too loud. Things like that can go a long way also towards achieving the results you're looking for.
You mentioned the pacing issue and how you can see their reactions. You can also hear the reactions based on, I've often found that if we're rehearsing something for too long, kind of the learning curve, we get better, and then we actually almost start getting, it certainly flattens and then almost starts getting worse.
Exactly.
And it just, you're more efficient to go, as you say, to a run-through or something like that.
It's sometimes you've reached the peak of how well they can play a certain passage that day, and you say, okay, I'm going to let it alone for now. We'll try it again at the next rehearsal or next week. There's no point, because it's going to be a point of diminishing returns. It's better to move to something different.
And let the ensemble know that.
Yes.
This is not perfect yet,
yeah.
but we're going to move on.
But we'll move on, and it will be better the next time around, I'm sure.
Earlier you mentioned the idea of telling them, using analogy or saying this needs to be more heroic, and there's that old saying in orchestras, professional orchestras saying, just tell me louder or softer, shorter or longer. How do you find that balance about when to just be very specific and when to be essentially poetic?
You know, it depends on the ensemble that you're working with. You really have to understand your ensemble. Are you dealing with local community orchestra of adult amateurs? Are you dealing with students in high school? Are you dealing with college students? Are you dealing with a semi-professional group or fully professional? They all have their different reactions to this kind of rehearsing. If you're going to deal with the New York Philharmonic, they don't want to know about where the sunrise is in this movement. They really do want to know just, okay, let's get it done with, who's too loud, who's too soft. And you can show a lot of that character in your demeanor, in your stance, in your gestures. You can show the sunrise. You don't have to tell them about it. They will pick up on those very subtle visual cues.
Or they already know.
Or they know, exactly. But the less experienced younger groups may not know the piece. They may not be reading your gestures as specifically as you would like, because they're busy still reading their notes. And they may need more of a context. They may need a greater understanding of how does this relate to how. I was very fortunate earlier this spring. I had a guest conductor in one of my rehearsals, and he was able to talk about a relationship between the second movement and the fourth movement theme and how it's different when it comes back. And I thought to myself, this is something he could never do in front of the professional orchestra that he is normally affiliated with. And I talked to him afterwards. He said, yes, I couldn't get away with that with the other group, because it's just, they want to play the notes and go home. And so in a sense, we have different responsibilities with different levels of ensemble, and we have to learn how to read their reaction to what we're saying and how much we can get away with if we want to be poetic and descriptive or biographical or historical or whatever the case may be. I found sometimes my groups at the university are very grateful to have some inner knowledge of a piece when we first start to work on it. They're happy to hear about the circumstances of composition, or what does it relate to in the composer's output of other works or something like that. And it gives them a context, and then we don't have to bring that up later on.
Yeah. In terms of the difference between amateur groups and professional groups, another way of looking at that might be that at the professional level, they have complete control over their instrument, whether it be a violin or a voice type or a flute.
Right.
So if you say short, they have the skills to make the note shorter.
Exactly.
Whereas for an amateur, sometimes short, you have to find another way to access those skills. So if you might say, like little pellets, or as you say, heroic, and it motivates them to do something physically that they may not be able to do with a simple,
exactly.
simple
Yeah, even playing short notes, you're right, like saying little pellets, or like raindrops, or like snowflakes, you know, different. Any kind of visual imagery works extremely well with younger players, with less experienced players, and then they can find a way to translate that into a technical solution for their level of ability.